Today's video is sponsored by Incogni, of whom more in a bit. Recently, I found myself standing at Baker Street Station waiting for a Hammersmith and City Line train. Now those platforms are very old. They're on the oldest section of the entire Underground, in fact, opened on the 10th of January 1863. And it got me thinking, what was it like to actually ride on one of those first Underground trains over 160 years ago? The first Underground line was the Metropolitan Railway from Paddington to Farringdon. In those days, Paddington Bishop's Road to Farringdon Street. The aim was to provide a connection between the mainline termini at King's Cross and Paddington and the city. Now, this is of course part of the Metropolitan Line, and it's also used by the Circle and Hammersmith and City lines. It's still a very busy part of the network. The earliest account we have of a journey on the Underground comes from before it was opened. On the 13th of September 1862, a special inspection train was organised carrying 300 passengers. These passengers included shareholders, VIPs and representatives of the press. This went down the line from Farringdon, allowing passengers to get off at each of the unfinished stations and inspect. According to the London Journal, the general feeling was that of agreeable disappointment, the opening cutting being more extensive, and the tunnels being better lighted and ventilated than was expected. Interestingly, and confusingly, the same article refers to Farringdon as Victoria Station. Before the line was built, Farringdon Road was named Victoria Street. I don't know if the station was originally going to be called Victoria, but imagine trying to negotiate the Circle line with two Victorias on different sides of London. It's hard enough to figure Paddington out. At this time, an underground railway was an entirely new concept, so I suppose people weren't sure what to expect. That being said, the ride would certainly not have been comfortable. Illustrations and photographs from the time indicate that the passengers were carried in wagons owned by the contractors who worked on the line. Now in those days, goods wagons were loose-coupled. To put it crudely, they were connected together by nothing more sophisticated than chains. The wagons would frequently bump together, and managing a heavy goods train needed a skilled driver. Early on, railway companies began providing a van at the back of the train where the guard would be stationed with a strong brake, and he was as important as the driver or fireman. As you can see though, there was no guard's van on this first train. I think these illustrations of people at the back of the train standing up and waving their hats must have been artistic license. That being said, the ride was probably a lot less bumpy than on some lines. Partly because the track was brand new and laid on a bed of gravel, but also because it was broad gauge. One of the main lines the Metropolitan Railway connected with was the Great Western Railway at Paddington, who also ran the railway for the first few months. And the thing about the Great Western was, well, it was laid to broad gauge, so the Metropolitan had to be as well. The Metropolitan line is only just below the ground. If you really want to go underground, metaphorically speaking, you have two options. One, buy the Jam's back catalogue, or two, get Incogni. See, when you're online, your data is constantly being mined and sold to data brokers. I don't know if you've noticed, but websites are getting ever more aggressive about things like cookies. Don't even get me started on breaches and leaks. And once the data brokers have that information, they pass it on to, well, who knows who. Best case scenario, some jerk you've never met knows everything about you. Worst case, identity theft and all the dangers associated with that. Now here's the interesting thing. Legally, these brokers have to delete your data if you ask them to. But of course they don't make it easy. You have to jump through all sorts of hoops, and when your data might be with hundreds of brokers, well, who has time for that? That's why Incogni is great. Create an account, authorize them to work for you, and they will do the legwork for you. I've noticed a dramatic reduction in the amount of spam I get since I started using it, and a consequent reduction in the amount I swear at my phone. And now is the best time to go incognito, to go incognito with Look, there's a Black Friday sale on. It's a great time to get incogni. Follow the link below and use the code HAZARD to get a really rather splendid 60% off an annual plan. Alright, let's leave the murky depths of information theft and return to the admittedly still pretty murky depths of the London Underground. Broad gauge was the invention of Isambard Kingdom Brunel. Now the thing about Brunel is that while he did have some great ideas and designed some pretty awesome stuff, he was pretty flawed as an engineer. He had this tendency to come up with ideas that looked really cool but weren't very practical, and broad gauge was one of these. When he designed the Great Western Railway, there were various track gauges in existence, but the one that was emerging as the favourite was a gauge of 4 feet 8.5 inches. This was known as Standard or Stephenson gauge after George Stephenson. He didn't invent it, but he really liked it. Brunel thought he could do better, and came up with a gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, although most people ignore the 1/4 inch. This was broad gauge. Now, in many ways, he was right. A broader gauge meant a more stable train. They could go faster, they were less likely to come off the track, and importantly, for the purposes of our narrative, they gave a smoother ride. But it was non-standard. If you had to send a load from a destination on a standard gauge line to a destination on a broad gauge line, it had to be transferred from one train to another, which slowed things down. And if two companies of different gauges operated over the same route, you had to lay a third rail between the broad gauge rails to allow standard gauge trains to use it. That was how the Metropolitan was laid, because the standard gauge Great Northern Railway had the right to send trains over it. So in some ways, passengers on the first Metropolitan trains would have been fortunate, not so much bouncing around. Of course, an early preview run for the benefit of publicity is not going to be the same as the experience an everyday commuter has. So what was that like? Well, those first trains were steam-hauled, not electric. Now, if you've ever seen a steam locomotive in operation, I'm sure you've already figured out the problems of running these in a tunnel. Now, to be fair, the Metropolitan Railway was not entirely in tunnel. It was constructed just below street level, and wherever possible it was left open to the sky. Before the Metropolitan opened, their engineer, John Fowler, experimented with a locomotive nicknamed Fowler's Ghost. This had a boiler lined with brick. The idea was that the firemen would stoke the fire in open sections of the line, and the heat stored in the bricks would keep the boiler going in the roofed sections. So in theory, it would produce no smoke in the tunnels, and the exhaust steam would be discharged back into the water tank using condensing pipes. So in theory, it would release no steam at all. In practice, it didn't work. Either it didn't generate enough steam, or it generated too much, and the railway didn't have time to iron out the flaws, so they went with more conventional locomotives. Still, that didn't stop them from informing the press, pre-opening, that their wonderful smokeless engines would be hauling the trains. Instead, the Great Western Railway supplied a type of locomotive known as the Metropolitan tank engine. These were purpose-built and coal-fired. Like the Ghost, they had condensing pipes discharging into the water tanks. This did reduce the amount of steam, but brought its own problems. It meant that the water in the tanks got hotter and hotter. As the water feeder worked using differences in temperature, it became less and less effective. It also meant that it was harder and harder to control the temperature of the boiler, which you really do not want in an age when locomotives were so fond of exploding. Driving one of these things was a high-pressure job in more ways than one. The stops were also rather closer together than was normal, so trains had to pull up quite sharply. This put a lot of strain on the connecting rods and the brake blocks. The Great Western and Metropolitan railways had a falling out very early on, and this led to the Great Western leaving the Metropolitan to their own devices. The Met hurriedly ordered their own locomotives and coaches towards the end of 1863. Their engines, known as the A-class, burned coke. This produced less smoke than coal, so offered some improvement. Passengers, of course, soon complained of the atmosphere in the tunnels. Trains were frequent, so despite the best efforts of the railway, smoke and steam built up faster than it could be dissipated. There was a distinctive burning smell in the stations, which must have been quite unnerving. This wasn't just from the coal, but from the brake blocks, which were made of wood and, well, high friction and wooden brake blocks were not a winning combination. Naturally, the foul air in the tunnels caused health concerns. Normally, railway staff were expected to keep their facial hair neat and minimal. Locomotive crews on the Metropolitan were allowed to grow luxuriant beards, in the belief that this would filter the air for them. As for the passengers, well, they might not have been exposed to the air for as long as the train crews, but there's a story reported in the New York Tribune that a young woman named Dobria actually died as a result of the smog down there. Exactly when this happened isn't clear, and the New York Post states that she had an existing bronchial condition. So I don't know how much of this is actually the deadly danger of the infernal underground, and how much of it is tabloid sensationalism. I can't help but feel that if things were that bad, we'd have a lot more than one death. Some quack chemists, based near to the stations, invented medicines to deal with the health concerns arising. A patent medicine known as Metropolitan mixture was apparently very popular. The Metropolitan themselves countered by arguing that actually the smoky atmosphere was beneficial for sufferers of asthma, bronchitis, and other chest conditions. I mean, this was the 19th century when just about anything new was likely to be touted as a cure for something. Suffice it to say that there is no scientific evidence for any of it. Apparently the stations were quite brightly lit according to the press of the time. There was gas lighting, as in the stations were lit by gas, not the company was sending people down there to say, "It's not dark, what are you talking about?" Gas lighting was the brightest form of lighting in those pre-electric days. There were also these openings down onto the platform to let daylight in, which you can still see at some stations. Other stations were fully open, so had the full benefit of daylight. What about when you got on the train? The original carriages were again supplied by the Great Western Railway. These were wooden 8-wheeled coaches. Modern tube trains are what we might call open plan, but railway carriages back then were divided into compartments. Third-class compartments were unupholstered, which no doubt resulted in many a numb posterior. The coaches were lit by gas, which was pretty good in an age when oil lighting was common for trains. Passengers reported that the ride was smooth and comfortable, although it was likely a lot less smooth than we're used to nowadays. Modern coaches have their wheels mounted in swivelling bogie trucks, whereas these ones had a rigid chassis with the wheels mounted directly to it. There were no doubt plenty of bumps and jolts. Unfortunately, in order to keep up with demand, the Great Western soon started interspersing their own older coaches in with the new ones. These were oil-lit and quite dilapidated. Given the state of the relationship between the Met and the Great Western, I wonder if this was a deliberate power move by the GWR. After the GWR went home and took their toys with them, the Met bought their own coaches. Perhaps in a kind of charm offensive, these were not only gas-lit, but upholstered for all classes. They also included smoking compartments, which can't have helped the air quality. In an effort to reduce bumping, pairs of coaches were close coupled together, and these pairs were assembled into larger trains. A distinctive feature of underground carriages in the days before sliding doors was that the tops of the doors were rounded. That is so that if the train stopped in a tunnel, the doors could be opened without scraping the tunnel roof. Overcrowding on the underground is nothing new, and this revolutionary new form of public transport found itself overwhelmed by numbers of passengers from the start. Contemporary reporters described crowds building up outside the station, comparable to those outside a West End theatre when a famous actor was performing. Trains ran every 10 minutes, but it wasn't enough. In fact, one of the reasons the Met and the GWR fell out was because the Met wanted more frequent trains. So we can conclude that a journey on the very first underground trains was likely not very pleasant by modern standards. Very crowded, uncomfortable seats, kind of bumpy, though not as bumpy as on the other lines, and with very poor quality air. Now, none of these complaints will be totally unfamiliar to the modern passenger, but compared to how things were 160 years ago, we've got it easy. Well, I do hope you enjoyed this atmospheric tale from the tube. If so, I would be grateful if you'd leave a like and consider subscribing for more. I would like to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your generous support. You are the gas lamps to my wooden coaches. I'd also like to thank Incogni for sponsoring this video. Check out the link in the description below to take advantage of their rather generous offer. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.